All right there, everyone. Black voters are increasingly abandoning the Democratic Party. That's what we're going to be talking about on today's video. But before we do, again, just a very quick reminder that you can download my book, The Triumph of Tradition, absolutely free on the link below if you want a nice balance of the theoretical and the evidential basis for a new conservative age rising, then this book is for you. It's my gift to you for free at the link below. And I'm glad to say we've had thousands of downloads. This is really exciting. All right, you may remember a couple of days back, we did a video on a recent poll that surveyed more than 16,000 registered voters between the ages of 18 and 34 over the course of 3 months in 2018. We found that a significant number of young white Americans were abandoning the Democrats, especially when compared with the results of the same poll taken 2 years earlier. And what we found is that the 15-point gap that favored the Democrats back in 2016 has been completely wiped out. Young white Americans were leaving the Democratic Party in droves. Well, it turns out they're not alone. There are a number of indicators that show that the black voting constituency, which is probably the single strongest constituency within the Democratic Party, they're beginning to have second thoughts here as well. A Zogby survey released back in May found that black support for Democrats was down an astonishing 20% since January this year. Another poll taken a few months back surveyed black women. It was the Black Women's Roundtable Essence poll, and it found that black women, who were in many respects the heart of the black voting constituency for the Democratic Party, the poll found that black women were beginning to abandon the party as well. According to the survey back in 2016, black women supported the Democratic Party by an overwhelming 85%. This year, that number has fallen to 74%, 11-point drop. Furthermore, we can even see some populist sentiments developing here. For example, the percentage of black women who said that neither party represented their interests jumped from 13% in 2016 to 21% in 2017. So, of course, there's no sign that they're, joining the Republican Party en masse. That's for sure. Republicans still remain very unpopular among blacks. But having said that, I'm sure many of you heard that Kanye West came out, in support of Donald Trump when he tweeted out the selfie with him wearing the MAGA hat, Make America Great hat. Many of you probably heard that support for Donald Trump among black men surged right after that. This was according to a Reuters weekly tracking poll that found that President Trump's support among black men doubled from 11% to 22% in the span of a week. It was at the end of April, just shortly after Kanye came out in support of it. Another example comes from difficulties that Missouri's Democratic Senator Clara McCaskill is facing in her re-election bid with black voters within her constituency. McCaskill, of course, is white, got blasted by some black activists at a town hall meeting who accused McCaskill of not caring about the needs of the black community. She's not doing anything for them and just taking them for granted. And so when McCaskill drafted a letter that was designed to defend her record of support for black political interests, black Missouri lawmakers in the Democratic Party actually refused to sign it. Because they basically, on the one hand, they agreed with the activists, but at the very least, they knew that if they signed it, many of their constituents would feel betrayed. So clearly things aren't looking very good for the Democratic Party at the moment if their number one constituency is beginning to have second thoughts. What on earth is going on here? Well, what we seem to be seeing here are the limits of identity politics and cultural Marxism. Okay? The Democratic Party's coalition, its contemporary coalition, is based on the globalist notion of what is called emancipatory politics, okay, which is a very simple concept, but very important if we want to understand the politics of globalization at a wider level. Emancipatory politics is a globalist-inspired political idea that basically re-envisions the state, the government, as a grand liberator or emancipator of individuals and groups from cultures, customs, and traditions that are now deemed oppressive and discriminatory, right? So globalism transcends all cultures, customs, and traditions. And then globalism in turn bestows civil rights on all people, totally and completely irrespective of any culture, custom, and tradition. And so when cultures, customs, and traditions are seen as getting in the way of those globalist endowed, invented civil rights, it's then the job of a just government, just in terms of a globalist notion of justice. It's now the job of a just government to overrule those cultures, customs, and traditions by bestowing preferential treatment and special status on minority groups now considered oppressed or disenfranchised. That is what's called emancipatory politics. Now, in many respects, emancipatory politics is the globalist version of what's more popularly called cultural Marxism, right? Cultural Marxism sees culture and society as made up of power discrepancies, where you have a dominant power, usually labeled as white, that disenfranchises politically and socially minority cultures through supposedly sexist, racist, and classist exclusions. You know, this is where you get the whole notion that one can only be a racist if one actually has power. It's the prejudice plus power definition of racism. It's thoroughly cultural Marxist. It's touted by the likes of Al Sharpton and the like, used by a lot of people with power. Well, what I would argue here with the flight of blacks from the Democratic Party, we are seeing the limits of identity politics and cultural Marxism, technically speaking, emancipatory politics. We're seeing that such an approach to coalition building has its limits. And what are those limits? Well, here with identity politics, we inevitably begin to see the interests of one group clashing with the interests of another, right? I'm sure you're all aware of what the Democrats are now doing when it comes to ICE, okay? After that cultural Marxist Alexandria Cortez defeated the longtime incumbent Joe Crowley in the New York primary, her radical call to abolish ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that utterly radical call started getting echoed by the Democratic Party rank and file, from New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, several other prominent Democrats, Kamala Harris in California. They all started calling for the abolition of ICE and immigration border enforcement, you know, all in the name of standing up for the Latino, or as Obama says, the Latino. Well, guess which constituent group in the United States wants border enforcement perhaps more than any other group? Did you guess the black community? A recent Harvard-Harris poll found that black voters favored reducing legal immigration. Did you hear that? Legal immigration. They favored reducing legal immigration more than any other demographic group. A whopping 85% of African Americans wanted less than the million plus that is allowed currently on an annual basis. Not only that, 54% of blacks opted for the most stringent choice in the survey, which was 250,000 migrants or less, or, if you can believe it, the other choice, none at all. No immigration at all. And the studies have demonstrated this is a perfectly rational position. In an article in the Los Angeles Times, the journalist Dave Seminara, he documents study after study from the likes of Harvard economists and others that the number one demographic most negatively impacted by immigration, both legal and illegal, are young black men. This is not even controversial at this point. The degree of certainty from the corroboration of these studies should settle any and all debates on this issue. Young black men are far more disenfranchised from Democrat-defended immigration practices than anything done by any Republican, bar none. So I would argue that here we're clearly seeing a clash between the political interests of two different groups within a coalition built on emancipatory politics. You see, this is why the Democrats use fear and intimidation, right? They can't appeal to the logic of policies and political platforms, since doing so inevitably alienates one of their identity political constituencies, inevitably, right? So what they do is they push this whole notion of power discrepancies. Remember, why do you vote Democrat? You vote Democrat because if you don't, they'll want to put you back in your chains, as that borderline illiterate Joe Biden once said. I'm ashamed to be from Delaware here. Or as the two-time loser Hillary Clinton just said of the Republicans, they want to send you back to the 1950s. This is what they do. They have to do this because the moment they get into policy procedures and platforms, they inevitably alienate one or more of their constituencies built on a coalition of competing identities with competing interests. So, of course, we'll be keeping an eye on how things develop here, but there is no question the two of the major voting constituencies of the Democratic Party's coalition, namely young millennials on the one hand, as we talked about on a previous video, and now black voters on the other, they're beginning to very noticeably erode. And with the erosion of these major constituencies, we may very well be seeing the beginning of the end of the liberal Democratic Party.